The history of the Third Reich is heavily involved in mysticism and the occult. If you watch the documentary footage from the Nuremberg rallies of the NSDAP, you will see these torchlight processions in the form of swastikas. You will see how banners hang, how columns are built. That is, of course, it all resembles a performance. It all resembles some kind of mystical, ritual action. This is visible to the naked eye. Of course, this was different from everything that happened in other countries. That is, there was no such thing in the Soviet Union, nor in the United States of America, nor in Great Britain. But in Germany, it was. When you look at these frames, at the frames shot by Leni Riefenstahl or at the frames of any other chronicle, you see that this is some kind of very dark, very mystical, occult action that unfolds just before your eyes. Where did all this come from? Of course, one can argue that the German nation has always been close to mysticism. We can talk about philosophy. We can talk about the way of life. In fact, any person, in principle, tends to the dark side. Not even to the dark, but to the unknown, to mysticism, occultism. The Germans were no exception here, but perhaps, indeed, it can be said that they stood out among other European nations for this. Although we, too, listen, in the days of the fall of the empire, in the last years of the life of the Romanov Empire, we also had occultism in full bloom, from Rasputin to Elena Blavatsky. Sorry, we also had a craze for Tibet, for higher powers, and so on and so forth. And occultism was quite widespread among the elites in 1918. An organization called the Thule Society is being created in Munich. The myth of the Atlanteans will be developed. It will receive in general a completely monstrous explanation, rebirth in Hitler's Germany. Well, in general, here is 1918, and here is such an occultist, mystic, conspiracy theorist, Rudolf von Sebetendorf. He creates this Thule Society, which includes Munich intellectuals who are interested in, seeking to touch this mysticism. What is the history of this society? Why was it created at all? Atlanteans, to put it primitively, after Atlantis sank, they moved to this island, or to this place of Tula, which is unclear where it is located, either closer to Iceland or closer to Greenland, somewhere in Scandinavia. So they moved there, and they gave birth to the Aryan race. So if you watched, and of course you watched 17 moments of spring, in the same place in your personal affairs, remember, all the time this reference is true Aryan, Nordic character. And as if in childhood it was completely incomprehensible to me what this means. Here are the true Aryans. These are people who, according to the Thule Society, appeared from the Atlantean fathers, and it was the main such race on Earth. And the Germans came from these Atlanteans, from these Hyperboreans, from this huge, most important Nordic civilization. The Germans were her main descendants, and the search for these roots and these connections was the philosophy of the Thule Society. The society was certainly conspiratorial. The society was certainly racist, because then there appears a man whose name is Hermann Wirth, and he is writing a work on the origin of humanity. What is written in this work? There is a Nordic race. It created everything beautiful on Earth. It invented a language. It invented a culture. And then there was southern Gondwana. There were all sorts of subhumans there, from blacks to Slavs. These are all second-level people who adopted the Nordic language, distorted it, and, in general, with their incestuous relations with Nordic people, they have degenerated humanity. Therefore, the Germans are more or less still preserved. They are descendants of this main dominant race, and therefore the Germans need to unite in order to preserve this purity of the race and in fact show that they are the main people on Earth, superhumans, and all the others are second-class people. It was an absolutely scientifically, in quotation marks, grounded theory. All kinds of evidence were collected or pulled by the ears for it. And as we will see later, she quite seriously rolled and was perceived by the German elites. Moreover, it cannot be said that it was a circle of some imposters or scammers or crazy people, although there were also some who hung out in this society, in Thule. Absolutely not. There was a Munich professorship, there were Munich big industrialists, and, in particular, there was a man like Otto Rahn. I partially talked about him in the program about the Cathars, about the Albigensian Wars. He was excavating in France. He was digging up Montségur. This is the last refuge of the Cathars, and was looking for the Holy Grail there, because he clearly believed that the Holy Grail was moved there. He was a famous archaeologist. Please subscribe and click a like button. Your support really motivates us. And now we continue. And thus the Munich elite, the German elite, begins to be imbued with these ideas of the Thule society. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, Germany is living in a state of national shame, and this mythology that we are descendants of a superior race, it fits very well. Then those who have later become the main actors of the National Socialist Party Germany fall into this Thule society. First, Rudolf Hess got in there. How? There was a professor in the Thule society whose name was Karl Haushofer, and Rudolf Hess worked as his assistant. And he got into this Thule society. He really liked these ideas of the superiority of the Aryan race, the superiority of the German nation. And he got into it. And at some point he brought Hitler there, and Hitler was very imbued with all these ideas. Then there will be a constant debate about whether Hitler believed in this mysticism or whether he used it. We will not look into this because, in fact, well, Hitler is an absolutely finished scumbag. And whether he did all his crimes rationally or being subject to some kind of mysticism, it does not matter to us at all right now. The main thing is that he got there too. Hans Frank is a future Nazi criminal. He also got into this Thule society. And at this moment, on the bow of this mysticism, on the bow of this occultism and the rise of this Nazi movement, the Workers' Party of Germany is being organized. At the same moment, a swastika appears. If you look at the swastika, we now know for sure that this thing, which we associate with Hitler's Germany, is nothing more. But in fact, of course, this is a sign that is older than Germany. For the first time it appears in Buddhist texts, that is, in all Hinduism, in the East, in China. The swastika is still present. If you get to Bali, if you get to India, you will see that the swastika is used in ornaments. This is a sign of a talisman. It is a sign of well-being, prosperity. And this swastika, it first appears in the Society of Thule, and then it migrates to the symbols of the National Workers' Party of Germany. And at some point, when Hitler is already growing stronger as a politician, what we know as the National Socialist Party of Germany is organized. And this swastika in a white circle, inscribed in a red banner, it was approved personally by Hitler, and it becomes the standard of Hitler's Germany, first by the party standard, then by the state standard. It is also a completely occult symbol, which was pulled not from the depths of German philosophy, but from the depths of this Tibetan philosophy. The Thule society is somehow developing, and Hitler's ascent to the political Olympus is going on in parallel. And all these people are closely intertwined with each other. At the turn of the 20s, our main, if I may say so, hero, Heinrich Himmler, gets into this party. A person who at that moment begins to look for a foothold, begins to look for a new philosophy for himself. Because he was a Catholic, at some point he was interested in religion. Then he realized that religion does not give him anything. And so he begins to look for these new points of support, and he gets into the circle, into the crowd of the Thule society. And imbued with these ideas, Himmler is a man whom we know as the main person responsible for the Holocaust, as the main person who signed all these orders for the extermination of people, for the final solution of the Jewish question. This philosophy falls just like honey on his lips, because apart from the fact that the German nation dominates there, the Thule Society is a wildly anti-Semitic organization. They published the newspaper Beobachter in Munich, which would later become the Völkischer Beobachter, the main printing organ of Nazi Germany. And this is an absolutely militant anti-Semitic leaflet. It simply proved that Jews live like an abscess on the body of the German nation. We lost the war because of them. They control everything. Here. Well, all the nonsense that you can hear from anti-Semites, it was absolutely written and justified there. Because, after all, educated people created it. Himmler likes it wildly. He starts spinning in it. Himmler, from childhood, apparently, was exposed to the occult and mysticism. At some point, either it appeared in his head or someone suggested it to him. Maybe over time he acquired it. He began to feel like the reincarnation of Henry the Fowler. It was a German leader who united the Germanic tribes for the first time. And so he will continue to nurture it in himself. And you will understand further where it will lead. In general, here are two parallel streams. This is the occult mystical and the National Socialist, which are very closely connected because, let's speak in modern language, this is one party. In 1935, Hermann Wirth, about whom I started talking, is holding an exhibition, The Heritage of German Ancestors, and they're in full growth with all the artifacts that were found in the excavations, stones, runes. This is the dominance of the Germanic civilization. The German civilization that gave the world everything. And there appears the first grain that Christianity, which spread in Europe, it strangled the Germans because German shrines were destroyed. Those pagan pre-Christian ones, the nation was crushed. And then it began to be discussed. Himmler visits this exhibition, he really likes it. It's already 1935, the Nazis are in power, and Himmler is already the head of the SS, that is, Hitler's personal guard. And he has this exhibition, and the Society Heritage of German Ancestors, Ahnenerbe, he takes it under his wing and says, listen, this is all very good. Why is it so easy for Himmler? Because it's easy to come and say that we are Aryans here, we have a Nordic character, and therefore we are the main race. It's good, but it's not enough. It is necessary to bring a scientific basis under this. And this occult mystical current, which is still looking for the beliefs of the ancient Germans, evidence of their dominance in Europe, this Ahnenerbe Society for Himmler's propaganda fits very well. He takes him under his wing. Wirth becomes the president of Ahnenerbe, and then they start driving hand in hand. At the same moment, a person like Richard Dara, who is the Minister of Agriculture, gets to exhibition. By that time, he had already written the work Blood and Soil, where he talks about the villages of the ancient Germans, about the true bonds of the German spirit, and all this fits very well for him too. And here it is necessary to make the necessary digression. On the one hand, we understand that Hitler was subject to mysticism, but probably to a lesser extent. But Himmler was completely exposed to it. The reincarnation of the Birdman, the creation of a new religion, the Black Order of the SS, the monastic brotherhood, this will appear further and further. But the most important thing is that, of course, we cannot say that they were all occult mystics there and believed in it with their sick brains. Of course there were such people, but a huge number of scammers appear around this. Because how do all these mystical practices work? If they see that the client is ready to believe in it, they immediately start selling it to him. And customers are happy to buy it. But we know in modern life, big businessmen have some fortune tellers, magicians, sinologists, who surround them with this whole areola of legends, beliefs, natal charts, and so on and so forth. Nowadays we see that it is developed, and then it was developed even more. Here is one example. A man named Karl Maria Wiligut appears in Himmler's entourage. He is from the old German aristocracy, on the one hand. On the other hand, he is a patient of a former psychiatric hospital, because he tells everyone that his family originates from Thor, the Scandinavian god. Here is his family from Thor Leeds, who stood with a hammer. And Himmler likes this story very much. Because Wiligut is engaged in excavations, he says that there are a huge number of ancient German temples and shrines where there are magical artifacts that give power, that give the ability of telepathy and telekinesis. And Himmler begins to support all this. There is also a Wirth nearby, which justifies all this from the point of view of ancient texts, sagas. Immediately, there is a story with runes. If you look, what is double S? These are 2 sig runes. These are Scandinavian runes, which were very common in Germany. They were not only in the SS, they were on the chevrons of various regiments, and all this bloomed in full color. Because what are runes? It's not just some ancient Scandinavian letter. It's a talisman. It's a mystical symbol. Himmler really liked it when they showed him that it was possible to connect 2 runes of the sig, and this, on the one hand, would be the SS logo, and on the other hand, the strongest amulet from everything. And of course, Himmler was happy to believe it, and everything was fine until 1936. In 1936, Hitler attacked Hermann Wirth, the chairman of the Ahnenerbe Society, with savage criticism. He says that we are building a completely different future here. What the hell are Atlanteans? What the hell is mysticism? What are you fooling people with? Here, the Aryan nation. Yes, the Aryan nation. I understand that. These are all your occultisms, runes. It's all nonsense. You can tell Himmler that. But he's a generally reliable guy because, really, Hitler appreciated Himmler very much. He called him Faithful Heinrich. He was an excellent courtier, an amazing manager, knew how to play bureaucracy, knew how to play all these intrigues, was a very effective comrade. Therefore Hitler appreciated him, but he knew that he had such a sin in his head. Well, let him do it separately from everything else. But it's not necessary to spread everything to the Third Reich, because you confuse people with this. And Wirth came under terrible criticism of Hitler. Henry Himmler at some point realizes that this will not end well, and in 1937 he expels Wirth from Ahnenerbe and becomes the head of Ahnenerbe himself. And he will transform Ahnenerbe from the Society for the Study of the Heritage of German Ancestors into a research institute that will cover all spheres of German society. Ahnenerbe becomes a research institute. In this sheet, there are departments that I will now announce. But in fact, there were 3 more sheets of such departments, just to show how deeply they have penetrated into all spheres of German society. Department of Astronomy. He was engaged in the study of some cosmic bodies. This structure is completely unimportant, but nevertheless it was there. The Department of Biology, which was engaged in work on the improvement of the human body, which was engaged in medicine and so on and so forth. Department of Botany, breeding and breeding of new plants from wheat to sheep. Department of Geology and Mineralogy, research of waters, soils, and so on. Because there were completely different stories, on the one hand, geology was important in order to build secret bunkers, landfills. On the other hand, the study of waters. In Abkhazia, Lake Ritsa, there was an Ahnenerbe expedition, even before the war with the Soviet Union, in which water samples were taken and the water turned out to be so good that the Germans were then keen on creating plasma for blood, and this water was great in their opinion. That's the kind of research they've been doing. Excavation Department, who all over Germany, then all over the occupied territories, dug up traces of the ancient Germans, dug up temples, the remains of sacrificial fires, weapons of war, agricultural implements in order to collect, recreate in parts this heritage of the German nation. The Department of German Art, which was supposed to prove that German art was from ancient times, it dominated Europe. There the case was quickly closed in 1938. This department was already shut down. Department of Heraldry. Well, how about the new elite without coats of arms, right? Naturally, they were looking for ancestors in the 8th or 10th generation. They drew coats of arms. There is an important digression here. In fact, there is a story about how a German actress told Himmler that you are talking about Aryans, blue-eyed, tall blondes, real Germans, these ancients who defeated the Roman Empire, who gave battle to the Roman legions in the Teutoburg forest. And you look at the top of the Reich. Well, Himmler looks like a monkey in general. Hitler is also some kind of devil. And why aren't you Aryans like that? You don't look very Aryan. And she was like answered, but on the other hand, we are Aryans in spirit. Well, of course, it's also a very strange story. But, nevertheless, such a department was created that dealt with these roots. Department of Indo-German and Finnish Relations Research. The Germans were looking for fragments of this Aryan race all over the world. In Scandinavia, in Tibet, in Finland, in the Baltic states. They proved that they were part of a large Aryan proto-civilization. The Department of Meteorology, the Department of Karsts and Caves, which dealt with old caves, ancient cave settlements of the Germans. Plant genetics, research departments of sagas and legends, because there is also the power and mystical beliefs of the ancient Germans, which can be applied in modern times. There were completely strange theories that swords were found in the Teutoburg forest. If you take him by the hand, you can reunite with your ancestors. It sounds like nonsense, but people have been promoting it to themselves. The Department of Bulk Inhabited Hills is also an excavation that was conducted in Germany. Inhabited Hills is also an excavation that was conducted in Germany. And there they searched for traces of ancient civilizations. Department of Occult Sciences. It's clear what he was doing. The department that dealt with Department H, which dealt with witches. And this is also very interesting because Christianity interfered with the Third Reich. It was necessary to create a new religion. Himmler played it with pleasure, and he sold it to Hitler that the Germans needed a new religion. This is not Christianity. Let's turn to paganism. They collected these testimonies about burnt witches all over Europe to give them out as proof that, in fact, witches were amazing witches, helped people, and Christians burned them so that this German civilization, German spirit, German spirituality, it disappeared. And so they collected all over Europe. They made a card file. 35,000 witches were found burned all over Europe over the past 400 years. The department of the expedition that was engaged in expeditions. Department M is mathematics. People who were engaged in research, they will be involved in the creation of the V2 rocket. Well, plus the national departments that were responsible for Scandinavia, Holland, Britain, and so on and so forth. That is, Himmler had a very clear plan. We must introduce the Ahnenerbe as a research institute into propaganda, religion, children's, school, and institute education, into party, cells. Thus, we will be responsible here for spirituality, for the ideological base of the Third Reich. In fact, it seems to me, and many generally say this, Himmler saw himself as Hitler's heir, and he created the entire SS structure, which turned from Hitler's security detachments into a huge second army, and he created his own religion. He created his own almost monastic Black Order in order to then lead the Third Reich after the victory over the Soviet Union. Here we will win the war, Hitler will already be old, and that means I will manage it all. That is, he was creating a future basis for his rule. Returning to the Tibetan monks, whether they were under the rubble of the Reich Chancellery or not, I do not know, and in general, no one knows for sure. But what we know for sure is that the SS sent an expedition to Tibet. The expedition was led by Ernst Schaeffer, a man who was engaged in Hinduism, the study of Tibet. And in 1938, this expedition went to Tibet. There is still an important point here. One Dalai Lama has died, and the second, as they say, has not yet taken roll. And there was a time of Dalai Lama Nesses. Excuse me such marginal jargon. And so the Germans are welcomed there, in the city of Lhasa, in the capital of Tibet. They show them ancient artifacts. And the main task of the Germans is to find a connection between the Tibetan civilization of the old and this civilization of the Aryans, who are descendants of the German nation. This connection must be found. Different things happen there. They collect artifacts. They are given old manuscripts. They take out high-altitude Tibetan wheat, which ripens in 60 days in very poor soils of the highlands, so that this wheat can then be planted in the territories of the Reich. They are engaged in measuring skulls. You know that the Germans were obsessed with this. Here, there is an Aryan structure of the skull. There is a non-Aryan one here. They go and measure these Tibetan skulls to show that the race of Tibetans, the race of Germans, are all pieces of this large national formation called the Aryans. They are arranging a radio bridge, and it will operate until the end of the war. Permanent Lhasa-Berlin radio bridge. And there is a myth that they were looking for Shambhala. This is a secret place where if you get there, you get superpowers, move in a parallel world, attack from a parallel world, then go back and forth from there, act in 3 dimensions at once. That is, they are completely subject to all this mysticism. It is clear that they did not find any Shambhala, but the expedition is returning to Berlin. Tibetans presented old manuscripts, presented dishes, presented a Tibetan Great Dane to Hitler, who never got there, in my opinion. He died on the way. And as a result of this journey, a film is being shot, which is called Mysterious Tibet. It is shown in cinemas in Hitler's Germany. And there the connection is proved that this is Tibet. All these Tibetan lamas, all this occultism that is present, there is a part of our German nation. Here, look at their aggressive dancing. That is, we also have this aggression and the expansion of our living space. It's in our blood. This story is being built. Another expedition in 1938 leaves for the Middle East. They are also looking for artifacts of this old civilization. The third expedition was in 1938. In 1939, they returned, went to Iceland. They deal with the heritage of the Vikings, who are also part of the German nation. Runes, runestones, amulets, and so on and so forth. In addition, well, to say what is called by the facts, in the SS was taught absolutely seriously, and only for SS members was taught the reading of runes and the study of Edda. This old Scandinavian epic, which I once told about in an issue about the Vikings. In addition, the SS men were lectured that when you talk about our ruthlessness towards prisoners, the ancient Germans drowned homosexuals and people, the mentally ill and traitors in the swamps. That is, we have always been an aggressive nation that expanded our habitat. So be worthy of your ancestors. Here, there was such a trip to Scandinavia. There was a man whom Himmler liked very much. His name was Uriah von Grenhagen. He was a Finn-born, lived in Germany. Please subscribe and click a like button. Your support really motivates us. And now we continue. He translated the ancient Karelian epic Kalevala, and there, too, traces were naturally found. In this epic, traces of the ancient German civilization. Himmler really liked it, and he sent this jury to Karelia. And in Karelia, he searched for traces of the old German civilization. He compiled a file of witches, and by the end of the war, they had brought this file to 30,000 forms. Together with these witches, they explored occult possibilities, telekinesis, mind reading at a distance, information delivery at a distance, hypnosis. All this was carefully studied. I mean, obviously, right? That there were, of course, a lot of scammers, but some people believed in it seriously. In 1940, the same expedition was equipped to the Baltic states, where they also searched for traces of ancient Teutons, because he was a Teutonic order in some way, partly in Prussia, partly on the Baltic lands. They also searched there. It was believed that his knowledge was not lost. It passed from the ancient Germans to the medieval knights, then to the Teutonic order, then to the knights, partly to the Freemasons. They collected all this search for rudiments from crystal skulls, which I told about in the release about Mexican civilization, to the Holy Grail, which they tried to dig up in France, in Montségur. All these artifacts were collected in Berlin in order to collect them all and give strength to a powerful new civilization of the Third Reich with a magical, mystical property. Schaefer, who led the Tibetan expedition, will come to the Soviet Union, to the Caucasus, in the 42nd year. The war is already underway. They will be engaged in excavations in the Caucasus. And at some point, about 7 years ago, a mysterious chest was found in Adygea. A chest with Ahnenerbe symbols. There were 2 alien skulls lying there. Well, here are photos of what these aliens look like. As a result, it turns out that there were simply deer without frontal lobes. They dropped these frontal lobes and skulls in general, then accidentally got into this chest. And the chest indeed remained after the Ahnenerbe expedition in 1942. That is, the Germans were digging into the mountains there, looking for all these mystical moments in the 42nd year. Another Ahnenerbe expedition to the Crimea. The Crimea had already been captured by the German fascist troops. Why did they go to Crimea? Because the invasion of the Gothic tribes in Europe, the barbaric invasion that attacked the Roman civilization. Who were the Goths? These were the ancient Germans. And in the Crimea there was one of the important parts of the Gothic kingdom. And that's where this expedition is going. They begin to dig the sites of ancient people in order to find artifacts of our German nation, the forerunner of which was this Gothic kingdom. It all ends in nothing. Because in general, they had an absolutely amazing plan, that Crimea should then be such an island boarding house for the highest elite of the Third Reich. Oaks were sent there because oak is a true German tree. Special wheat was sent there to make crops of pure wheat, which only Aryans can eat. There it was planned to make such a boarding house for the highest ranks and the party elite. That was the plan. Funding was already written out for it. But only then the Crimea was naturally lost as a result of the actions of the Soviet army. And then Germany lost the war, and these plans were not destined to come true. But, nevertheless, they were looking for the Gothic kingdom. In all seriousness, they were digging up everything there. By this time, Otto Rahn was finishing excavations by the beginning of the war. By 1941, he was finishing excavations in Montségur. And here, too, there is one of the evidences that when he returned from France, he declared at the Swiss customs some kind of copper vessel for distillation, or a copper cube for distilling liquids. In fact, there is a legend that he found the Holy Grail and took it to Germany. We'll never know anything about it. Otto Rahn's fate is generally sad. He became completely disillusioned with Nazism, with the beginning of Hitler's actions in Europe. he was sent to a concentration camp, and there, either he was killed or he died. There is a version that he escaped, changed his identity in general, and disappeared into history. By this point, the person we started talking about, Hermann Wirth, is no longer the head of Ahnenerbe. After criticizing Hitler, he was removed from the position. Himmler personally headed this institute, and Wolfram Sievers became the chief administrative person. This is the man who now holds all the power in this organization, Ahnenerbe. He is engaged in the organization of financing. He is engaged in administration. And this man, who will be hanged after the Nuremberg trials, he is responsible for all the atrocities of Ahnenerbe in the concentration camps. I'll tell you about this later. Well, these are the expeditions of the Third Reich. That is, the Nazis scurry around different parts of the world and collect mystical artifacts that supposedly belong to the German nation. These artifacts, they must be put together, and then this whole mystical power of the ancestors, it will enter the new man. Because the Germans were already obsessed with the selection of the new man. Himmler organizes the SS really as a monastic order. SS men are selected according to the principles of ancestry. That is, an SS man before joining the SS, he shows his pedigree before 1800. If he wants to get married, he must show the genealogy of his wife, so that God forbid there were no Jews there, no Tuntermens. That is, by breeding, they wanted to create a new race of blue-eyed blondes. Tall, strong, physically strong. The SS did not just pass, they just signed at the registry office or got married in the church. There was a special strong ceremony. It was an SS wedding, at which representatives of the nomenclature had to be present. Children were prescribed to be conceived during the spring or winter solstice, as the ancient Germans did. That is, this whole compote of mystical conspiracy theories, which are now flourishing on YouTube channels with some anti-vaxxers, there it was all in full growth. It was straight reinforced concrete prescriptions. Himmler was seriously puzzled and concerned about history. First, the extermination of Jews who interfered with the German nation. Secondly, the breeding of this new nation, a new race of masters. Well, and accordingly, a new religion. As a consequence, he really built some kind of his own. He had this completely new civilization of his own in his head, which, I think, after Hitler's death, he wanted to lead. To finish with mysticism and move on to completely practical horrors, we need to talk about artifacts. The Germans searched everywhere for these artifacts. Well, as I said, they tried to dig up the Holy Grail in Montsegur, the last refuge of the Cathars. Crystal skulls were searched in Latin America. In the 40s, an expedition to Lake Titicaca was supposed to be sent, but it did not take place because the war broke out. There was a Hammer of Thor project. This is the madman Carl Maria Willigood, who traced his ancestry from Thor. He came up with a scientific project that the Hammer of Thor was actually the strongest electric weapon. And so, Ahnenerbe is creating an electric weapon that was supposed to collect lightning energy, convert it into a blow to enemy equipment, and cut it down simply without any artillery shells. This project existed. It was funded. It was called the Hammer of Thor. The second project was called Gold of the Rhine. The Gold of the Rhine is one of the ancient German legends. With the help of Aryan technology, gold can be extracted from the water of the Rhine. The project was funded, then, of course, it was closed. There was a project, the Spear of Longinus. This is the spear with which Jesus was pierced by a Roman guard. There are several such copies. One is kept in Vienna. This Viennese spear was taken out of Vienna during the Anschluss and brought to Germany. A copy was taken from it. It was declared the only spear of Longinus. In particular, you may know it under the name Spear of Destiny. It appears in my childhood computer game, Wolfenstein. Person who possesses the spear of destiny, he is the ruler of the world. This spear was brought to Berlin, and a copy was taken from it. One of these copies was given to Himmler, who placed it in his castle. We'll talk about the castle separately later, so that we can close the dramatic arc of mysticism completely. I'll move this story forward a little bit. Well, while some are looking for Shambhala, others are translating Kalevala and collecting witches' files, the other part of Ahnenerbe are doing absolutely practical things, namely medicine and science. Germans are passionate about several things. The first is to find a cure for cancer. Here they turn to ancient Germanic homeopathy, the study of botany, the study of herbs, the study of the mysterious Aryan tea that healed wounds. And one of the people who are starting to do this was Philipp von Lucerberg. He is a botanist, he is engaged in homeopathy, and he is researching how herbs can be used to treat cancer. No cure for cancer was found, because after the war and during the war, Germans continued to die from cancer. This is what is called from more or less harmless. There was such a man whose name was August Hirt. He is known for the fact that he was engaged in research on how gas affects a person. To do this, people who were in concentration camps went to experiments. What amount of gas a person can withstand? That's if you give 1 dose of gas and then give an antidote. Will he survive or not? I'm telling you very roughly now, because I'm not a medic and I don't want to dive into it. Well, all the experiments were on prisoners. He is known for the fact that he was still, of course, a complete anti-Semite, and he proved the superiority of the Aryan race. He proved this with the help of his pseudoscience. This is the measurement of skulls. He had a laboratory in Strasbourg. When the Allied troops entered there were still bodies in formalin, which he dissected for pseudo-medical purposes. He had a huge number of skulls of Jews, where he proved their flaws. Here are the measurements, you see, correspond to the fact that this is racial inferiority and so on and so forth. There was a man who was engaged in medical experiments on prisoners in concentration camps. There was a man whose name was Edward May. He was engaged in a seemingly harmless thing, an entomologist. He studied parasites, rats, cockroaches, insects of all kinds. He was engaged in the development of biological weapons for the Third Reich, and by the end of the war, these weapons were practically created. Then all these archives and drawings disappeared. We will also talk about this separately later. But, nevertheless, the Germans came close to developing bacteriological weapons. Another man, his name was Heinz Brücker, he was engaged in plant genetics. In a nutshell, how to make more fertile wheat, potatoes, tomatoes, and so on and so forth, because the question of products was very important. At some point, he declares that the Germans experience a food shortage in the coming centuries. Because here is the plant genetics that we have come up with, we will embody it. How did he come up with it? Partly he developed some works himself, and partly, for example, with the help of such SS military units on the territory of the Soviet Union, he stole the archive of Vavilov, our geneticist, who was defrauded here in the Soviet Union. And based on his work, Heinz Brücker began to create his own works on plant breeding and crossing. He was not put on trial after the war. He was also engaged in botany and plant breeding, engaged in all kinds of fertilizers. He ended his life in Argentina. He was killed, he was 71 years old, on his own farm, and, according to rumors, he then developed a parasite that affected cocaine plantations. When the Colombian mafia found out about it, they killed the old German. That's the story. Alex Berg is another well-known homeopath, as well-known, in quotes, who was also engaged in experiments related to herbs that should be applied to the body. They healed wounds, developed Aryan tea. That is, it was also some kind of prop, in my opinion. But nevertheless, he was doing it. and one of the scariest bastards, a man named Sigmund Rascher. He worked in Dachau. He had a personal correspondence with Himmler. He was engaged in the theory of hypothermia, when prisoners were frozen, and then this freezing was fought with this very Aryan tea, or, for example, hot water. We watched as a person. Now he has already been put into a state of near death, how quickly he can be unfrozen. Because it's very important for the front. There was a theory of spiritual warmth that if the human body of a frostbitten person is heated, he will recover faster, and so on and so forth. A huge number of people died from this. Experiments in pressure chambers when a huge number of people, well, 2 out of 200 people survived. There were such statistics. In the pressure chamber, the pressure is low, and as a person with this pressure, how long can he last? These experiments were very important for the submarine fleet and aviation. These are the experiments. Sigmund Rascher finished badly enough because in addition to hypothermia, pressure chambers, poisons, and wounds, which he also dealt with, people were simply wounded and then watched how quickly blood could be stopped in battle. People were bleeding, and experiments were being done on them. In addition, he was engaged in gynecology. He said that I would cure German women of infertility. Here, my wife, at the age of 49, gave birth to the second. At 52, the third child, because we invented a miracle drug. Now I have only tested it on my wife, and then we will deliver it at the pharmacy. And Himmler also liked it super much, but at some point in the 40s, Sigmund Rascher's wife was caught in Munich. She tried to steal a baby at the train station, and a terrible investigation began, and it turned out that all these children who were allegedly conceived by her at 40 and almost 50 years old were not her children. They were abducted babies. Rascher did not make any super discoveries in gynecology. 2 of them were exiled to a concentration camp. His wife hanged herself, and Rascher himself was executed by a bullet in the back of the head in a concentration camp the day before the approach of the Allies. Either they wanted to cover up some traces or something. Well, in general, that's how his story ended. Ahnenerbe, as you can see, really covered all layers. On the one hand, people were engaged in mysticism to fuel the Aryan theory. On the other hand, quite practical experiments in order to provide the front and tactical medicine. Himmler very often participated in Ahnenerbe's scientific councils, and as president, he was very deeply involved in this whole story. Question: who paid for all this? Because Ahnenerbe had phenomenal funding. Why did they attract young scientists? Because they paid well there. Of course, such things as the Rhine Gold, they were quickly closed, but nevertheless, serious developments in the field of botany, medicine, disaster medicine, and so on, they were funded very well. Many young German scientists went there. Who paid the money for it? The budget partially paid, that is, the Reichsbank financed this research institute, Ahnenerbe, and partially and in fairly large sums financed the so-called circle of Himmler's friends. What is it? These were industrialists and manufacturers who were outside politics. As they would later say at the Nuremberg trials, they were part of Himmler's circle of friends. Here are the 2 biggest, as the donors would say now. Ahnenerbe are Daimler-Benz and BMW. These people established grants, financed, and transferred the money for which all these experiments were arranged. I believe that it works in such a way that, on the one hand, of course, we can say that, well, Himmler's people came to Mercedes and said, "Give money. Mercedes can't refuse it." And on the other hand, we understand how it all works. Mercedes had military orders, BMW had military orders, plus slaves from concentration camps worked in their factories. That is, it was an absolutely mutually beneficial cooperation. And the funding was amazing. The second question is, where is Hitler here? because it's very convenient to imagine him as a mystic and a madman, a psycho. But it wasn't quite like that. According to rumors, he was a man. Not according to rumors, but according to the memories of eyewitnesses, he was a talented, intelligent, and very practical man. And here in the part where it rolled for him, that is, the creation of a new Aryan race, a new religion, because he also did not believe in Christianity. He believed that the Germans needed a new religion. That's where it worked for him. He supported Himmler. Otherwise, he was not interested in it all. Himmler at some point gathered all these mystical things into not just a vault, but into such a theory of the higher forces behind Hitler. And of course, he raised everything to Adolf Aloisovich, and, of course, Hitler liked it too. Because it turns out that I'm not just moving the German nation forward, but I'm doing it with the help of these pagan ancestors of mine. That is, it is a mission. It is not just a power grab. It is a missionary. Of course, Hitler really liked it, and Himmler played it very successfully. But my opinion is that Himmler really believed in it. He believed in it, and he played the faithful dog of the regime everywhere, the faithful dog of Hitler. And he had the nickname Faithful Heinrich, because he said everywhere that I was just a reflection of Adolf Hitler. On the one hand, and on the other, of course, he was building a new German civilization for himself. This is what we will talk about now. Naidi in 1934, the history of the Wewelsburg Castle begins. This castle appears in many films and in the same game, Wolfenstein Castle. This is, of course, the prototype of the Wewelsburg Castle. This is Himmler's residence. Originally, it was planned to build a school there, such a forge of SS personnel, where there would be an SS university, a training camp, and so on and so forth. In 1934, it began. The place, this castle, why was it chosen? Because Karl Maria Willigud, who, as we already know, traces his lineage back to Thor, he sold this idea to Himmler, that there is a castle that is located near the main German shrines. On the one hand, this is the Teutoburg Forest, where the Germanic tribes first defeated the legions of the Roman Empire. On the other hand, the Exer Stones, look how they look. This is an ancient cult place for Germanic tribes. And there, somewhere, grew the Irminsul tree, which the ancient Germans worshipped, and which Charlemagne had already cut down in the time of the Franks. It was the tree of life of the German people. And since then, this Christianization has been displacing and strangling the Germanic race. And next to these shrines is this Wewelsburg Castle. And Himmler first starts building a school for the SS there, and then he actually builds his residence there. Here comes the history of the Black Order of the SS, because the SS is not just an organization. There are military detachments. Here are Hitler's personal security detachments, and so on and so forth. Himmler looked at it as a monastic brotherhood. Here, the famous SS ring, the dead chapter. Here, look at what it looks like. These rings were issued and awarded personally by Himmler. Now this is a rarity, because there are very few of these rings. Numismatists are chasing them. A silver ring on which a dead head is depicted, SS runes, and the name of the owner is stamped. This ring was given to you personally by Himmler as a sign of appreciation and great achievements before the SS. If a person died, this ring was sent back to the Wewelsburg Castle, and there it lay in the crypt, in the pantheon of fallen heroes. This ring, it could not be lost. God forbid to sell or exchange. It was the property of the order. He looked at the SS as a monastic order, hence the training in runes, because it could bring happiness, a talisman, and some superpowers in battle. Herbert Yankun gives these lectures to the SS on the ancient German device, on how the sword of the ancestors can give you superpowers, and that's all pumped up. The spear of Longinus, of which I have spoken, a copy of it was brought there, to Wewelsburg Castle, and it stood in Himmler's study. The whole office was also covered with runes. I was in this castle once. It was blown up in 1945, and the North Tower is the main one where everything happened. It was restored. The tower is divided into several floors. At the bottom, there should be a crypt with the most important SS heroes who were buried there, and at the top, there is a circular hall. At its base in the dome, in my opinion, there are 48 windows. This is the Hall of the Holy Grail. There is an eternal flame burning, and pipes from it still remain. And the famous one is this black sun, which is still there, all this mosaic it left on the floor. Here's what it looks like. This is also an old Tibetan symbol. In Wewelsburg Castle, in this place, tourists, please, can come to see. There, indeed, I'm not inclined to believe it, but the energy there is lousy. Somehow you don't feel very well. I mean, there's something there. I'm not saying that there are some secrets of fascists in the basements. No. It is clear that people gathered here, some crazy, some fanatical, some just bastards, who soaked the whole place with their energy. Himmler made his residence out of it. Moreover, if you look at the map of Wewelsburg, it had to be rebuilt. And here's the castle. It's like a triangle, like the spear of Longinus looks. That is, it was all built up, and it was all based on the symbols that Himmler desperately nurtured. Hence, all this connection with Tibet. Himmler at some point got hooked on yoga, on Hinduism. That is, he is beginning to confess all this. He was clearly preparing to lead the future structure of the world. Runes, artifacts, all this was brought to the castle. In 1945, the castle was blown up because the Soviet army was already advancing. But, nevertheless, now it has been restored. You can visit it. Silver rings, death's head rings, the spear of fate were to be kept in this castle. Everything I told you about. This also includes the legend that the famous mythical, of course, battle at the last birch tree took place on the site of the castle or near this place, when this civilization of the West clashed with the civilization of the East in immemorial times. Thus there was a split into two tribes, and then the Eastern tribe tried to absorb the German nation, but history is silent about what this battle of good and evil, in their reading, how it ended. That is, all this was built on a completely wildly mystical basis. Himmler was preparing a new religion. Well, if the Haxen department, which was responsible for witches, is such a conspiracy and mystical story, with these witch forms collected all over Europe, then the M department was a completely practical Ahnenerbe structure that dealt with mathematics. It was headed by a man with the surname Bozak. According to various kinds of evidence, Ahnenerbe members were embedded in all technological projects of the Third Reich. And I must say that the Third Reich had greatly succeeded by the end of the war. Look, the first jet, Mr. Schmidt, appeared there. The V-2 ballistic missile appeared there. The Germans came close to the decision to create a nuclear reactor. They practically developed biological weapons. In all these structures, there were Ahnenerbe members who saw the archives, who were engaged in the development. There is a version that Ahnenerbe was not allowed there. Only scientists were engaged in this. But the documents say something else, that of course Himmler introduced his employees into all these scientific developments. What happened to them? Well, they haven't disappeared anywhere. The archives went to the Allies. A man named Bozak, who was in charge of the M department, he disappeared without a trace after the war, as if he had never existed. Wolfram Sievers, who was the head of the Ahnenerbe, was at the Nuremberg trials, and at the subsequent trial, he was not tried at Nuremberg itself, but later he was on the list of people who were subject to punishment in the area of number 2000 or 2010. However, he was hanged because this man had some information that probably we, or rather the people who arranged the Nuremberg trials, thought it was better not to give it to the public. The Americans performed two operations, this Operation Clouds and Operation Paperclip, which was engaged in taking German scientists and Ahnenerbe employees to the United States of America. And, as we know, Werner von Braun, he was not a member of the Ahnenerbe, he was engaged in the development of the V2, but he was taken to the USA. Entry and work for all Ahnenerbe members on the territory of the United States was prohibited by Congress. Nevertheless, they were secretly transported, and these operations were classified, and classified. Ahnenerbe's archives are still classified both in the United States of America and here. Probably there is something there that I probably would not like to mourn. But, nevertheless, that's the facts of it. Himmler did not fall into the hands of justice. Unfortunately, he's in 1945. Faithful Heinrich, right? He began separate negotiations with the Allies in 1945. What kind of cynicism should be? He also went through intermediaries to the International Jewish Congress, a man who was responsible for the entire Holocaust, and offered his help. And as a gesture of goodwill, 100,000 Jews were released from concentration camps. That is, he tried to escape in this way. Hitler found out about these separate negotiations and why he actually chose Donetsk as his heir, and not Himmler. Because Himmler betrayed him. But, nevertheless, everything is over, the war is already over, and Himmler has been arrested. He was running. He fled using forged documents. He was arrested by 2 Soviet Red Army soldiers, then handed over to the Allies, and there he revealed his real name, said that he was Henry Himmler, and during one of the interrogations, he bit through an ampoule with cyanide and died. And, unfortunately, he did not live to see the Nuremberg trials. He was not hanged. Sievers, the head of the Ahnenerbe, was hanged later. But all the other members of the Ahnenerbe, about whom I spoke, they all lived happily. Here, for example, is Uriah von Granhagen. He died in 2003. That is, they have all lived a very long life. It is not necessary to say that these are mystical, of course. The forces of the ancient Germans entered them. But, nevertheless, they all continued to teach. Someone to engage in scientific activities. Someone went to Latin America, like a man who fought with cocaine plantations. They all, in general, did not receive any harsh punishments after the war. There was another person, the head of the Sonderkommando Hexon, which was responsible for the study of paranormal abilities and the description of witches, a man who collected 30,000 witch forms all over Europe. His name was Rudolf Levin. He also mysteriously evaporates in 1945. They can't find any traces of him. That is, the people who are responsible for such important departments. Here is the Department of Mathematics. As I said, the Department of Witches. Witchers. These people have disappeared. Perhaps they were taken out by the Allies, we don't know about it, or maybe they lived under a different guise in Latin America. The Ahnenerbe archives went to the Allies, the castle was blown up, then restored. That's where Ahnenerbe's story ends. But I would like to tell you about one more thing that is often associated with Ahnenerbe, although it probably wasn't connected with her, or maybe it was, who knows. Finally, I want to tell a story that is not directly related to Ahnenerbe, although many believe that it is. This is the history of New Swabia. There is a version that Hitler did not burn himself, did not shoot himself, or rather, did not take poison. He was not burned afterwards. He fled to Latin America. This is the first version, and the second version is to Antarctica. After all, there is a very old conspiracy theory about the Antarctic Reich. What is it? 1938 to 39. The German Society for Polar Research is equipping an expedition to Antarctica. Here, the research vessel Swabia is sailing there, having a Dornier aircraft boat, which can land on the ice, and then it starts from the deck, and then it is lifted back to the deck on a cable on a crane. Here they are exploring the Earth in Antarctica, in a place that is now known as Queen Maud Land. They find some kind of hollow karst caves. Describe it all. Why was this expedition needed? Germany then claimed this Antarctica. This is nobody's land. Well, how's nobody's? The Germans must have some part. Moreover, we are descendants of Vikings, and Vikings probably swam there, and so on and so forth. Here is the year 1938 to 39, a very big expedition. She returns to Germany. There are many scientific works of Antarctica as a new continent. It is necessary to establish a polar station there, and so on and so forth. This is what we know for sure. Where does the conspiracy theory come from? 1947, 2 years after the end of World War II. The Americans are organizing an expedition called High Jump. The flight time of aviation missiles due to Antarctica may be reduced and pose a threat to the United States of America. And this high jump, there are warships and planes. They are moving to Antarctica to explore this territory in order to see if it is possible there. The Soviet Union can put up some air bases there and attack New York. Several people die during this expedition. An accident at some ship. The expedition is returning. And then, in the press, after 5 to 7 years, stuffing appears. When the Americans sailed here, discs, flying saucers with swastikas began to emerge from under the water. They were shot there almost with lasers. They lost 5 ships there. This is New Swabia. This is the Third Reich, which sailed there after the defeat in the war with the help of submarines. Transported Hitler, archives there. Ahnenerbe fused the elite of the Third Reich with aliens. They received extraterrestrial technologies because they collected all these artifacts. And this civilization, she went under the ice of Antarctica and made a new Swabia there. If you go online, you will find 1,000 theories, 1,000 articles that substantiate all this, and evidence and newspaper plums about that. That yes, the Americans there lost part of the fleet during Operation High Jump, because the operation actually took place. Here is such a story about New Swabia that she, Ahnenerbe, participated here. Well, I see, right? As for Mr. Schmidt jet, I have already told you. But there are a huge number of stories about the fact that the Germans created flying saucers. They did not have time to use this weapon. The Germans came up with a weapon that changes geomagnetic fields and can cause earthquakes and so on. There's a whole box of mystical and conspiracy things further on, which all lie in this crypt with the inscription Ahnenerbe. But, nevertheless, this organization is semi-mystical, semi-occult, in fact, absolutely criminal, which was engaged in quite practical research. It really existed. That's how it started. That's how it ended. Well, finally, I would like to say about the man who created all this, about Rudolf von Sebottendorf, the man who created the Thule Society, who in turn created the Ahnenerbe. He fell into disgrace in the 40s. He bored everyone with his mysticism, occultism, and, eventually, he ended up in Istanbul. There, according to various testimonies, he played the role of a spy. That is, in fact, he was an employee of the Abwehr, delivering some information for German intelligence. Or maybe he just ran there and practiced the occult. We do not know this. We only know that in 1945, when Germany lost the war, he rushed into the Bosphorus one fine morning and committed suicide. Like that. That was the story about Ahnenerbe, about the most probably secret mystical organization of the Third Reich. I tried to tell you everything I found myself from the point of view of mysticism and from the point of view of practice. It was a really scary institution, which is completely different from computer toys or funny Indiana Jones movies there. It was a very real structure. Thanks. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss new episodes.